Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from apologist Dr. Terry Mortenson. In this video, he discusses the rise and fall of Christian America. So let's see what he has to say.
In the course of my travels, I've come to appreciate the uniqueness of America. This is a very unusual country in lots of ways.
Yeah, I'll say.
But it's very unique in one way, and that is that America is the country with the greatest number of churches and seminaries and Christian colleges, the greatest number of Christian radio and television and bookstores.
You know what? I'm not even going to bother checking this. Fine, I'll agree with you. The US has more BS shops per capita than any other country. Well, specifically Christian BS. If we include other religions in there, we probably could find countries with more religious resources than the US somewhere. I mean, I'm not going to bet any money on it, but yeah, let's just say you're right there.
And resources. We have books, DVDs, magazines, music, movies, concerts, camps, conferences. There's no country that is even a close second place.
And this is supposed to be a good thing? No matter how you look at it, it doesn't look good to me. We have all the bookstores and movies and media stuff, which all say mutually exclusive things about how the all-powerful creator of the universe works, which means that either he can't speak for himself and so is not all-powerful, or he doesn't care to correct the wrong ones. In which case, his message can't really be all that important if he can't be bothered to make sure everyone gets it accurately, right? Okay, let's take a different angle. Parents, in the US, you have all the resources you'll ever need to make sure your kids don't ever learn anything that contradicts Christianity. Of course, if Christianity is true, then an unbiased examination of all the evidence will lead one to that conclusion. So why do we need to teach kids specifically about Christianity rather than teaching about how to make sure you have a sound epistemology? How about instead of training up the young ones in the way they should go, we train them in how to determine the way they should go for themselves? I mean, there are other ways to look at it, but ultimately what it comes down to is the fact that every person who has ever written a book about the religion of Christianity thinks that the Bible is inadequate when it comes to whatever aspect of Christianity that they are writing their book on. If it were adequate all by itself, the supplemental book would not be necessary, right? Of course, this doesn't necessarily apply to apologetics books, the ones that are allegedly trying to convince the non-believer of the truth of Christianity, but the majority of religious books are supplemental rather than apologetic in nature. That is, they are directed at Christians and dedicated to explaining certain aspects of the Bible. As to the other resources, some Christian colleges are actually able to provide decent secular educations, while others are meant to continue the indoctrination process started by the parents. And yeah, there are lots of Christian radio and TV stations available in the States.
But if you've been paying attention to this country over the last few decades, and especially the last few years, you'll realize that America is becoming less Christian every day.
Not just less Christian, but less religious in general, depending on how you look at it. Because the other religions category on the annual Gallup poll went from 0% in 1948 to 5% in 2017, so that's an increase in that category. But the none category has increased quite a bit more, from 2% in 1948 to 20% in 2017. So overall, yes, less religious, but if we look at individual categories, there is an increase in the other categories, so that's more Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and any other non-Christian and non-Jewish religions. So the nones and the others are growing, while the Christians are shrinking. Okay, yeah, I guess I can give you the checkmark in the less Christian box for this category, and I know this will come as a complete shock to most of you, but I see this as a good thing.
Why is that? Why is it that the country with the greatest number of Christian resources, and we're getting more all the time, is becoming less and less Christian, even anti-Christian?
Because access to information is the enemy of brainwashing? Even if you successfully indoctrinate a kid, once they get on the internet, they can find the information that points out where their indoctrination was wrong. It's not that hard.
George Washington was our first president. And in his presidential farewell address in 1796, he said this: "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports."
George Washington also said that the path of true piety is so plain as to require but little political direction. To this consideration, we ought to ascribe the absence of any regulation respecting religion from the Magna Carta of our country. In other words, the government has no business in religion for or against.
He was thinking of the Christian religion.
Yeah, he probably was. Do you know why? Because he was Christian and lived in a mostly Christian society. I don't see why that's supposed to be a surprise to anyone.
John Adams, our second president, said this 2 years later. We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. John Adams was a committed Christian.
Yes, John Adams, the committed Unitarian Christian who not only rejected the whole idea of the Trinity, but also the divinity of Jesus. He was the kind of Christian that today would accept evolution and be perfectly happy to display a pride flag. I am okay with that kind of Christian. Are you?
Benjamin Franklin was not a Christian, but he said this just before he died. I am convinced that the moral and religious system which Jesus Christ transmitted to us is the best the world has ever seen or can see.
Well, unsurprisingly, that is a bit of a misquote and it leaves some context out. So let's have the whole thing. This was in a letter to Ezra Stiles, who had asked Franklin's opinion of Jesus. His response was, "As to Jesus of Nazareth, my opinion of whom you particularly desire, I think the system of morals and his religion as he left them to us the best the world ever saw or is like to see, but I apprehend it has received various corrupting changes, and I have with most of the present dissenters in England some doubts as to his divinity." He then went on to state that he doesn't see a problem with Christianity as long as it has good practical consequences.
He also said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters.
That's nice. But as was made clear by the context of the last Franklin quote, his idea of virtuous is that which does good to other human beings, not specifically Christianity. He thought positively of Christianity so long as it encouraged virtuous behavior, not the other way around. I'm skipping the last two quotes because this is ultimately irrelevant. The Founding Fathers had differing opinions on religion. Big whoop-de-doop.
Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, 3 of our Ivy League universities, they were all started to train men for Christian ministry. They are now temples of atheism.
Temples of atheism? What do you mean by that? Do you mean that they now offer degrees that are more useful than Masters of Masters of Divinity and whatnot? I mean, Harvard still has a whole school called the Harvard Divinity School where you can get a PhD in theology. Yale has a divinity school where you can get similar degrees, though they stop at the master's level rather than going up to PhD. At Princeton, you can attend their theological seminary and attain a PhD in practical theology, which sounds like an oxymoron to me, but whatever. My point is that these schools might have secular programs, but they also have entire campuses devoted entirely to religion and religious studies.
And we are facing a moral crisis that even many non-Christians are concerned about.
Okay, so on your little graphic there you have porn, abortion, divorce, teen suicide, transgender locker rooms, and homosexual marriage. The only thing on that list that is a problem in and of itself is teen suicide, and LGBTQ teens have an elevated risk of suicide. Do you know why? Well, to lay the blame entirely on any one individual factor would be a fallacy on my part, but I would be shocked if one of the main contributors to these elevated suicide rates wasn't discrimination by people and organizations like AIG. So remember next time you talk about suicide numbers, people like you, who marginalize LGBTQ people, are responsible directly or indirectly for a lot of them. But to address the other balloons, a lot of those are actually good things. Porn can be fun, and the only reason to avoid it is if you are convinced that the all-powerful creator of the entire universe cares what you do or don't do with your genitals. I mean, all things in moderation, of course, but in most cases, the benefits outweigh the harms. Abortion, while I wouldn't call it a good thing for its own sake, is a perfectly viable alternative to being burdened with a child that you're just not ready for. And before anyone just yells out adoption as a reasonable alternative, just keep in mind that around 17,000 kids every year age out of foster care without a permanent adoptive family. The average kid in foster care that gets adopted spends about 1.5 years in state care before being adopted. There is literally a crisis of kids needing adoptive families, so to add unwanted babies into that mix would just be cruel. Not to mention the physical trauma of going through the pregnancy of childbirth for someone who doesn't actually want or can't take care of the baby. And divorce? Well, if you're going to live in a society where you contractually bind yourself to living with another person, there should be a way out. Sometimes people change. Sometimes people don't change. Sometimes people will hide part of their personality until the knot is tied. Sometimes people just grow apart. To force them to stay in an unloving relationship is unhealthy for everyone involved. Now on to transgender locker rooms, I don't see how they could possibly be a problem for cis people. I know the picture you guys like to paint is some burly dude claiming to be a trans woman and hiding out in the girls' room in order to assault the girls, but let's be real here. If a trans girl tries to use the female locker room at, say, a high school, she is much more likely to suffer harassment because of it than any of the other girls. Same goes for trans boys using the boys' locker room. So how about when it comes to locker rooms and bathrooms, we all just stop looking at what's in between other people's legs, male, female, trans, or cis? And finally, we come to homosexual marriage, because two people that have nothing to do with you living together without a contract is apparently preferable to you than if they did have a contract, even though the measurable difference on your life is 0. Because, let's face it, whether gay marriage is legal or not, homosexuals will pair off into couples just like heterosexuals. They will move in together just like heterosexuals. They will go on dates and whatnot just like heterosexuals. They will engage in all the public behavior that scares you so much whether or not they have the contract. So you may as well just let them have their contract if they want it. Ugh, I suppose I have to let you talk now. Can't fucking wait to see what you have to say about these issues.
Millions of pages of pornography on the internet.
Yeah, there sure are. It's a fun time. You should try it sometime. Oh, who am I kidding? You probably do. Because you're human. And most humans do stuff like that. Even if they lie about it.
That are destroying lives.
If porn is involved in the end of a relationship, it probably wasn't the porn itself that was the problem. It might be the lying about using porn. Now, if porn is being used as a substitute for intimate relations with your partner, there's probably a problem that goes deeper than the pornography.
Including the lives of some Christian leaders who get hooked on that pornography.
The only reason it ruins their lives is because they've dedicated themselves to an organization that insists that porn is bad. So when they caught doing the very human thing that most people do, it creates a scandal. Do you know what would happen to me if it was found out that I had porn? Nothing, because I don't run around talking about how bad it is, so it wouldn't be hypocritical of me to have porn myself. In fact, I'll just go ahead and tell you there's a folder on my hard drive that is just filled with porn. Now watch in amazement as this fact being made public knowledge fails to affect my life in any way whatsoever.
We have murdered 60 million babies in America through abortion since Roe versus Wade.
You know, one of the technicalities that Christians often use to defend their God's murderous actions in the Old Testament is that the 10 Commandments, when properly translated, say, "Thou shalt not murder," not "Thou shalt not kill." So killing is okay when it's legal. So if you're going to be calling abortion baby murdering, then you're also implying that your God is now a murderer because of all the people that he killed. But semantics aside, the vast majority of those abortions were performed on fetuses whose brains had not developed to a point where they would have had any semblance of consciousness, and most of the remaining ones would have been for medical reasons. If you want my full opinion on abortion, it's that I don't think there should be any questions asked before the fetus is viable, that is, until it can survive without the mother. Once it can survive without the mother, then more consideration should be given to other options, but the health and safety, including the mental health and safety of the mother, remain paramount. So that's where I stand on the issue.
That is 10 times as many Jews as Adolf Hitler killed.
Gotta bring up Hitler when talking about atheism. Always. It's a law. You know, guys, Godwin's law is not a suggestion of argumentation style, it's a criticism of lazy argumentation. And do you know what? We have literally killed billions of times as many bacteria as Hitler killed Jews. Comparing how many Jews Hitler killed to aborted fetuses is not along the same lines at all. A blastocyst is not a person. A zygote is not a person. Until the brain develops, and here I don't mean develops the ability to twitch or give basic stimulus responses, I'm talking about the thinky bits of the brain that don't show up until the 3rd trimester. So until the brain develops, it's not a person. Even then, it's a debatable point. Like I said before, when it is viable by itself, that is when options other than abortion should be considered while keeping the mental and physical health and safety of the mother as primary goals.
The divorce rate inside the church is as high, well, actually now it's higher than outside the church.
Good for those people getting divorced while still belonging to a group that stigmatizes divorce. People who do stuff like that are usually the pioneers that normalize it for those that come after them. If you are unhappy in your marriage, divorce is an option. But here's the tricky part. Even the most amicable of divorces can get really, really complicated in a hurry, making life at least temporarily difficult for both parties. And that's a best-case scenario. So when someone is going through a difficult time in their lives, do you think that you guys throwing a pile of shame on top of that is going to help?
Shame. Shame.
If you're not going to be supportive and helpful, how about just minding your own damn business?
And that's because more and more people who aren't in the church aren't even bothering with getting married.
What's that? People outside of the church don't feel the need for a contract to legitimize their relationship? Maybe they're realizing that a lot of marriages end in divorce, so just in case your relationship is one of those, keep things simple by not getting married in the first place. And this is supposed to be a bad thing?
Homosexual marriage is now the law of the land?
Yeah, homosexual couples can get married now. And guess what? If you're not homosexual, you don't have to get yourself a homosexual marriage. So unless you're gay, this doesn't apply. So once again, if you're not going to be supportive and helpful, just mind your own damn business.
We're having court battles about who can go into what bathroom. And not only is teen suicide on the rise, but I just read a report just the other day in almost every state in America, suicides are up, not just among the teens.
Suicide is a very complex topic, and to just state this as if a fall in religiosity is solely responsible for the recent increase in suicides is disingenuous at best. Some studies have found that religion does play a protective role in suicide, but here's the thing. It doesn't matter what religion. Any religion has a protective effect, and the more homogeneous the community's religious beliefs, the stronger the protective effect. This suggests that it is the community and support network of like-minded people that is the most important factor in suicide prevention. And this kind of goes along with the next study I found, which was that religion is actually a risk factor in suicidal thoughts and tendencies among depressed patients, meaning that the more important religion is to the patient, the more likely they are to have had previous suicide attempts and a greater suicidal ideation. Now here, I am tempted to say that this is because religion tends to convince people that their depression is their own fault. They just need to believe harder to make it go away. So the harder they believe, the more devastating the repercussions when the depression does not go away. But that would also be oversimplifying it, because suicide is complex.
But the problems are not just out there in the secular culture. Back in 2000, Barna Research reported a minority of born-again adults, only 44%, and an even smaller proportion of born-again teenagers, 9%, are certain of the existence of absolute moral truth.
The number for adults there is distressingly high. Absolute moral truth really doesn't exist. A case could be made for objective morality, but absolute morality is absolutely out. Absolute morality is the idea that a given action will always be morally right or wrong regardless of the circumstances surrounding that action. My go-to example here is killing. Killing is wrong, generally, but what if it's in self-defense, or the defense of someone else? Then killing can be justified. Same goes for lying and stealing. Generally wrong, but what if the lie is to protect someone? What if you're stealing food to feed your starving family? That one's such an easy example that it's basically a movie trope at this point.
My sister's child was close to death, and we were starving.
If morality is absolute, then there are situations where you are morally obligated to do nothing and allow innocent people to die when you could have saved them. Even the Bible agrees that morality is not absolute. There are often different punishments for a crime depending on the circumstances surrounding that crime. For instance, if a woman is raped outside of the camp, then she is innocent and should be spared. But if she were raped in the camp, then she's guilty and should be put to death. But this only applies to married women. If she's an unmarried virgin, then she gets to marry her rapist. Hooray! If morality were absolute, then rape would always have the same punishment regardless of the circumstances. Same with killing. That's one of the big 10 that God doesn't want you to do, but he often does it himself and even commands people to do it for him. He once removed a king from power because that king didn't kill as many people as God wanted him to. So morality is not absolute, even if you somehow believe that biblical morality is actually good.
Think about that. Those teenagers in 2000 are now heads of corporate America, professors in the universities. Some of them are sitting on the courts of judges.
I would really hope that a judge would not believe in absolute morality when presiding over a self-defense case.
Are sitting in the halls of Congress at the state and national level. And they don't believe in moral absolutes?
Yeah, they probably don't, because the consequences and intentions of an action should be considered when determining whether or not that action is moral, with consequences getting extra weight over intentions. Moral absolutism is a very, very, very overly simplistic way of looking at the world.
It's no surprise that we are seeing what we're seeing.
What? That whole thing about LGBTQ people being allowed to get married? People being allowed to divorce when the relationship doesn't work out rather than forcing themselves and potentially their children to suffer through it? Women being allowed to not have lifetime consequences for one mistake, or in the case of rape, not having lifetime consequences for an event that they had no control over? This sounds like an okay world to live in, if you ask me.
2 years later, the American Family and Crises research by the Southern Baptist Council on Family Life uncovered some disturbing facts.
I'm just going to preface this with the fact that I have doubts about the veracity of any research coming out of an organization with a name like that.
Of the children raised in evangelical homes, 88% leave the church at age 18 and never return. And what this and other studies have shown is that this is not simply a Southern Baptist problem.
No, but I imagine the problem is proportional to how literally the denomination takes the Bible. Because when you're taught from birth that Genesis must be the literal truth or else the gospel message doesn't make any sense, then when you grow up and get internet access and learn for yourself that Genesis can't be literally true, you stop believing. If, however, you harmonize your religion with science from an early age, then I'd imagine this would have less of an effect once they grow up. Also, I question the veracity of the stat that 88% leave at exactly age 18, but if that's true, it's quite telling. They leave the church when their parents can no longer force them to go to church. Perhaps the problem runs a little deeper. And I say problem, but that's actually a great number from my perspective.
This is happening across the denominational lines. We're losing anywhere from 60 to 80% of the young people are walking away from the faith, walking away from the church, and many are walking away from the faith that they were raised in when they graduate from high school. Well, we wanted to know why, and so we commissioned America's Research Group to find out for us.
I mean, it's really not that difficult to figure out. If you lie to your kids for their entire lives, when they get old enough to go online and learn that you're lying to them, they then pretend to believe it for a few more years until they can move out on their own, and pretense is no longer necessary. If religious homes didn't have such a track record of throwing apostate children out of the house, I'm sure more would leave earlier, but they do, so they pretend until they don't need to anymore.
And we published the results of that survey in the book Already Gone. It was a survey to 20,000 people to find 1,000 people that fit this description. They were between the ages of 20 and 29. They grew up in conservative Christian homes and churches, and they rarely or never go to church. And we wanted to know why. And we found out a lot of very interesting things in that survey. But one question we asked is, when did you first start to have doubts about the truth of the Bible? And we thought the problem really started in college.
Oh, of course you thought it started in college. Because all the kids that are young enough that they're still living at home and don't have a choice in whether or not to go to church are perfectly happy to go to church, right?
Because the university is a very hostile place for the Christian today.
Not if you go to one of the 600 Christian colleges, which account for about 14% of the total number of higher education institutions in the United States.
But we were surprised. 44% said they started to have doubts in high school, 40% in middle school, 4% in grade school.
Yeah, that tracks. It makes perfect sense to me.
They were getting questions that were causing them to doubt the Bible, and they weren't getting answers.
Or they were getting answers, but the answers weren't sufficient because there were logical gaps in the answers that are so glaring that even middle schoolers can see them.
They weren't getting answers at home or in church. And those questions were working like acid on their minds and their hearts.
I mean, this wasn't my experience, but I know several people who asked their questions in Sunday school and were asked to leave because the teacher couldn't answer them satisfactorily, and it's better to kick out one kid than to have that one kid sowing doubt into the minds of the other kids with their perfectly reasonable questions.
Well, we asked them, what influenced you the most to doubt the Bible? 45% said the teaching of evolution in millions of years.
Yeah, that'll do it. If you're brought up being taught that God made the world 6,000 years ago and evolution is a lie, then when you learn about evolution and how it works for yourself and you see how reasonable it is, and see that the young Earth creationists are flailing around desperately trying to force the science to fit their preconceived notions, young Earth creationism starts to look more than a little bit silly.
Well, those were the 20 to 29-year-olds who grew up in the church but are no longer in the church. In 2015, we did another survey to find those who grew up in conservative homes and churches, but are still in the church. And we published the results of that in this book, Ready to Return. And we found some disturbing things. On the question of abortion, should it be legal? 52% of those 20-year-olds who are still in the church said, yes, or I'm not sure.
That is disturbing. It should be much higher than that. I'd also like to see the breakdown of how many said yes and how many said I'm not sure, because I feel like the yeses are in the minority here, and yes and not sure are two very different answers. Abortion is a complex topic. There is more to it than either you think it's a baby from conception so all abortion should be illegal, or you think it's not a baby until it's out of the mother so all abortion including partial birth abortion should be legal. There's a whole spectrum of opinions here that you're not accounting for.
Is homosexual behavior sin? 44% said no, or I'm not sure.
Again, that number is way too small. And even if you think it's a sin, it's still none of your goddamn business, so keep your hetero nose out of homosexual behavior and you'll be just fine.
Does the Bible contain errors? 39% of those still in the church said yes, or I'm not sure.
I mean, it does contain errors. This is another factor that can cause people to leave the church. If you teach them from birth that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, then when they start reading it and seeing the many errors for themselves, this now causes them to doubt their entire faith. But if they are raised more liberally with the idea that the Bible is God's message, but it was relayed by fallible people so errors do crop up sometimes, they will be able to stay faithful even when they find some of these inevitable errors. Even when you present the apologetics to explain away the errors, it's not hard to see that you must perform the most intricate of mental gymnastics to make them all go away.
And why do you think the Bible contains errors? These 20 to 29-year-olds still in the church said, 52% said the teaching of evolution in millions of years.
If you're looking to interpret the Bible literally, then yeah, that's an error. But one of my personal favorites is when Jesus refers to the mustard seed as being the smallest of all seeds but growing into a tree. There's a lot wrong here, so let's break it down. It starts with the mustard seed being declared as the least of all seeds. The plain reading here suggests that least is to mean smallest. It could mean least important, but then it grows into something useful, a mustard plant, whereas the seeds of weeds do not grow into something useful, so if that's the meaning, then it's wrong. If it means smallest, that's also wrong, as there are seeds that are smaller than mustard seeds, such as orchids, begonias, and petunias. Some have argued that he was speaking in terms of plants they would have been familiar with in ancient Israel, but this doesn't really work either, as black orchids were known then and have smaller seeds. Probably my favorite bit of gymnastics with this one is the NIV translation of the Bible. They originally added the word your in there, stating that it is the smallest of all your seeds, which could conceivably make the first part correct, but there is absolutely nothing in the original Greek to suggest the word your should be there, and this was so blatant that it was removed from the NIV in its 2011 edition. This just goes to show that while manuscript copying of the originals and adding, subtracting, or changing words for theological purposes might not really be a thing anymore, but people still make changes to the text to suit their interpretations. They're just not doing it by hand. But then we get to the second part of the verse, where it declares that the mustard seed becomes a tree. There is no other word that the Greek word used here, dendron, could possibly mean. It is only ever used as tree, both in the Bible and in the writings of others like Homer, Herodotus, Aristophanes, and more. It is tree, plain and simple. Except the mustard plant doesn't grow into a tree. It can look like a rather large bush if it gets out of hand, but it never gets to the point where anyone would classify it as a tree. And this is one tiny, minuscule error that has apologists scrambling for explanations, most of them unsatisfying. If you start with the view that the Bible is inerrant, then little things like this will cause you to doubt the inerrancy even after you read the explanations. This is my current favorite because I just learned about the NIV's little addition to try and change the meaning of the text and its subsequent rejection, but the error that actually started me down my path to atheism is one in the Christmas story in Matthew 2:2, when the Magi from the east declare that they saw a star in the east, and somehow followed this star in the east, they followed it east and got west to Bethlehem. There are a lot of ways this could be reinterpreted to avoid the error, and this one is much less airtight of an error than the mustard seed thing. But it planted the initial seeds of doubt in my head, and this verse is repeated every year at the Christmas service, so every year that seed of doubt got a little bit more water, and the doubts got bigger, and I noticed more errors, and the pastor would occasionally preach messages of biblical morality that I disagreed with, and eventually the doubts got so big that I decided to give the Bible a read-through because the preachers would always say that it's important to spend time in your Bible daily, so rather than going with the cherry-picking daily devotional, I would read the whole thing. Surely in context of the whole, these minor errors and nitpicks would vanish as I sought after God in His Word. But alas, I discovered that the God described in His Word is not someone that I want anything to do with, and so I left my faith behind me. All this to say that yes, evolution and millions of years demonstrate that the Genesis account cannot be literally true, but ultimately it's the little seemingly minor errors that will really get you.
So what do all these things have to do with each other? The growing moral crisis, the anti-Christian attitudes in our culture, the mass exodus of young people from the church. Well, Psalm 11:3 says, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?
Is this an admission that the Bible is destroyed? Because the Bible was the foundation of my faith, and inerrancy was part of that belief. So once it became clear that it wasn't inerrant, my faith left me. And this is where the hell concept comes in as being incredibly unethical. I mean, more unethical than just the fact that it exists, because I did not choose to stop believing. Belief is not a choice. I lost my faith while I was trying desperately to recover it. If belief were a choice, I would have chosen to remain a Christian. If you don't believe me that belief is not a choice, then try this. Change your fundamental religious beliefs right now. If you are a Christian, choose to be Muslim now. If you're a Muslim, choose to be Christian. If you're an atheist, choose to be Hindu or something, or whatever. Change your core beliefs right now. I'll bet that you can't. You have to be convinced of something before you come to believe it. So to send people to hell for not believing in you, something that you had no choice in, then you are sentencing people to eternal torture for a crime they couldn't help but commit based on how you designed them. It's bad enough that the eternal torture exists for good people just because they didn't believe, but to add on another layer where they didn't even have a choice in their beliefs is just adding vindictiveness on top of the cruelty. Well, that's it for this one. He just goes on for the rest of it trying to tie all these things in together, and I don't necessarily disagree with his tie-ins. I just disagree with his assessment that these are bad trends, with the exception of suicide, of course. He does mention at one point that the idea of millions of years was developed by deist and atheist geologists, and then Darwin built on that. So I would like to point out that Charles Lyell, who is largely regarded as popularizing the idea of an ancient Earth, was a devout Christian who had problems with the theory of evolution when it was published, precisely because of his religion. He actually posited that the Earth was infinitely old with no upper age limit. So, as is par for the course in AIG material, they have to blatantly misrepresent the facts in order to make their points. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Frank Frankerson, who says, there are problems with evolution. 1. Why are there no species in between stages? 2. Why are there different species at all? Shouldn't we all be evolving to the same point? So in answer to question 1, there are plenty of in-between stages. In fact, every organism is an in-between, but I assume you mean things that represent the in-betweens of major transitions, like how Archaeopteryx is clearly in between the extinct theropod dinosaurs and modern avian birds, with its not quite flight-worthy wings and bone structure and its teeth. Tiktaalik represents the transition from aquatic to land-dwelling animals. Darwinius massilae is possibly the ancestor that connects the apes to the rest of the mammals. There's a whole list of transitional fossils on Wikipedia. And what's more, there is often debate about where exactly these fossils belong on the phylogenetic tree of life. If they weren't transitional, meaning they contain features that should belong to a specific group, but they also have features that would place them in a different group, there would be no debate. It would be clear-cut. Now on to question 2, why are there different species at all? Shouldn't we be evolving to the same point? This is actually why often physical barriers are a feature that drives speciation. The selection pressures in different physical areas will be different, so different adaptations are beneficial. So when a population physically separates, the two resulting smaller populations are subjected to different selection pressures, and so evolve in different directions. And now, special thanks to the people that sent me volumes 1 and 2 of AIG's Demolishing Supposed Biblical Contradictions and the Book of Mark chapters 1 through 8 of the Anchor Bible series. I think this was 3 different people, but none of them came with names, so I can't thank you guys directly, but they are much appreciated. I guess now I have to do a series on AIG's book. And super special thanks to Dr. David Schneider, who sent me enough money on PayPal to keep the kids fed for either an entire week or one single meal, depending on whether or not they're going through a growth spurt at the moment. Links to social media and ways to support the channel are in the description, as well as my P.O. Box address. See you next time!